In this presentation, we're going to take a look at a few ER diagrams and interpret what they mean. These diagrams were created in Microsoft Visio, so they'll look a little bit different perhaps than the ones in the textbook. However, the concepts are the same. In this example, we see an associative entity type. There are three entities listed here in the view: order, inventory, and order line items. There is a many-to-many relationship between order and inventory. One order can contain many inventory items, and each inventory item can be part of many orders. In order to implement this many-to-many relationship on a physical system, we need an associative entity type. That's where order line items comes into play. When we need an associative entity type, what we do is we create the entity with two identifying one-to-many relationships. Here you see order line items and two lines coming into it. In both cases, order line items is the many side of a one-to-many relationship, specifically an identifying one-to-many relationship. We can spot that because the line for the relationships are both solid. Order line items you can think of as sitting in between order and inventory and acting as sort of a surrogate for the relationship. Now in this case, the relationship between order and inventory has a lot of attributes, and order line items takes care of those attributes. But since we have two identifying one-to-many relationships coming into order line items, you'll notice that the primary key is composite. There are two fields or attributes in the primary key, each of which is a primary key from the related tables. In this case, order ID and product UPC, both of which come from order and inventory respectively. The relationships themselves are one-to-many relationships. However, if we take a closer look at the cardinality, we can say that inventory has a one-to-many relationship with order line items, or more specifically, one piece of inventory can be included as zero or many line items, whereas for each line item it includes one and only one piece of inventory. On the other side, we can say that for each order we have zero or many order line items. Going the other way, we would say that each order line item is associated with one and only one order. Let's take a look at a different example here for three entities: loan, statement, and transaction. If you look at the relationship between statement and transaction, you'll notice that it is a one-to-one relationship. One statement involves one transaction, and one transaction is associated with one and only one statement. If you examine the relationship line between the two entities, you'll notice it's one-to-one because there are no crow's feet. You'll also notice that the primary key of transaction is the same as the primary key of statement. In this scenario, the primary key of transaction, statement number, is also a foreign key back to the primary key of statement. Looking at the relationship between loan and statement, you have a one-to-many relationship. One loan can contain one or many statements, and one statement is associated with one and only one loan. In this example, the relationship between loan and statement is non-identifying, whereas the relationship between statement and transaction is an identifying relationship. The difference that you can spot in the attributes or fields is that the relationship between loan and statement does not have loan number as part of the primary key. On the other hand, if you look at the relationship between statement and transaction has as part, and in this case all, of its primary key, the foreign key linking it back to statement. An identifying relationship always has on one side of the relationship a primary key, which is also a foreign key, back to the entity on the other side of the relationship. Take a moment to look over this and make sure you understand the concepts. In this portion of the ER diagram, we see four strong entities: zip codes, customer, vendor, and employee. They are all considered strong because they are not reliant upon any other entities for their primary key. If we look, for customer, the primary key is customer account number. For vendor, it's vendor ID. And for employee, it's EMP ID. For zip codes, it's zip. There are relationships between zip codes and the other three tables, and they're indicated by the dashed lines going from zip codes to the other entities. For example, zip codes has a one-to-many relationship with vendor, a one-to-many relationship with customer, and a one-to-many relationship with employee. In all cases, though, the dashed lines indicate this is not an identifying relationship. The many side of these relationships, the entities customer, vendor, and employee, all have foreign keys back to zip codes, specifically back to the primary key, which is zip. However, in none of these cases is zip part of the primary key for customer, vendor, or employee. If we look at the cardinality for these three relationships, they're all the same, which dictates how we would read the relationship going from one entity to the other. For example, zip codes, we could say a zip code has 0 or many customers associated with it. And going the opposite direction, a customer is associated with 0 or 1 zip code. In each of the other cases for vendor and employee, it would read very similar. For example, for a zip code, it is associated with 0 or many vendors, but a vendor is associated with 0 or 1 zip code. In this example, we see a more complex relationship between a host of entities. And you'll notice that for some of these entities, they have in parentheses next to their name the word weak. So what differentiates a weak versus a strong entity? With a weak entity, it borrows all or part of its primary key from another entity. In this scenario, you have building, which is a strong entity with a primary key of building number, and you have room, which is a weak entity, borrowing part of its primary key from building. The primary key for room is actually a composite of room number and building number, which is also a foreign key back to building. You also see an identifying relationship between building and room. The identifying relationship means that part of the primary key, or all of the primary key in some cases, will be borrowed from the other entity. We see a similar thing for the room-key type entity. This associates two tables, key type and room, and it borrows, in this case, all of its primary key from the other two entities, room and key type. There are two identifying one-to-many relationships coming into this entity, which makes it an associative entity. And again, it borrows all of its primary key from both of its related entities. We see another example of a weak entity in the entity called key, which borrows part of its primary key from key type. Now it's an identifying relationship as well. So a weak entity borrows all or part of its primary key from another entity, which means that the relationship, when there is one, and there usually is, will be an identifying relationship.